Last weekend, 2 mass shootings made the news in America, first in New York, also in California. The shooting in California happened on May 15th in Orange County, leaving 1 man dead and 5 injured. At a press conference the day after the shooting, the Orange County police identified the shooter as an immigrant from China and say that the killing was possibly motivated by hatred of Taiwan, which, as we know, is a self-ruled island claimed by China. However, in subsequent days, more details emerged about the shooter's identity and beliefs, which paint a much more complicated picture. Here to talk us through some of the nuances of this case and what it tells us about the complex history and complex history of Chinese and Taiwanese identities and what's going on between them right now is Grace Jackson, co-host of the Literary Hangover podcast. She is an expert on history and fiction and China, at least on this show. I know she doesn't like to be called an expert, but you are an expert.
Yeah, I want to talk about this this horrible thing that happened.
Yeah.
I'm sorry that I don't have light relief for listeners after your monologue. Maybe we should get Jackie the Joke Man in on an emergency basis.
He wrote that, by the way, that entire thing. It's one. Yeah, I think once I take a week off, I'll be a little less on edge. It's the midterms, and so let's talk about this: the shooting and the tension between Chinese Americans, I guess, and Taiwanese Americans. And
actually, it's not really about that tension, although that tension does exist. The reason I want to talk about this is that it really kind of gets to the heart of the complex and kind of interconnected history of China and Taiwan, or the histories, I should say, and what's at stake in how we interpret those histories today. And it's actually, this goes way beyond the quite simple geopolitical debate about whether Taiwan is a part of China. This actually brings to the surface a lot of the more messy questions about ethnic identity and national identity across China, Taiwan, and in the diaspora in the United States especially. So before we dive in, I'll just remind people of the facts of the case as we know them currently. So on May 15th, a 68-year-old man named David Cho attended a Sunday school class and a luncheon hosted by the Irvin Taiwanese Presbyterian Church. This is a group that worships at the Geneva Presbyterian Church in Laguna Woods, which I believe is something of a retirement community in Orange County. So Cho had driven 270 miles from Las Vegas to attend this service. He brought 2 guns with him and several explosive devices. He kind of hid out in the church after attending the service, and at some point in the afternoon, he began to chain the doors shut and also nail them shut. And then he began shooting. A 52-year-old man, a doctor called John Chung, and one of the youngest members of the congregation actually rushed the shooter and tried to disarm him, and he was killed. 5 other people were badly injured, and their ages were between 66 and 92 years old. So you can already get a feel for the nature of this congregation, quite elderly. To move on, I want to talk about
the location. Right? The shooter was also, the shooter, I believe, was like in his 60s, right?
Yeah, he was 68. And I'll get to him a little bit later, but first, I just want to talk about the location of the shooting and the nature of the community that it targeted, because these are very important factors. So as I said, this was mostly an elderly congregation of Taiwanese Americans who spoke and worshipped in the Taiwanese dialect, not Mandarin Chinese, and who identified as Taiwanese or Taiwanese American, not Chinese, and not Chinese American. Now, based on what we know about migratory trends and the history of the past 50 or so years, most of these congregants, I would say, will have left Taiwan in the 1980s with young families. after the US switched its recognition from the Republic of China on Taiwan to the People's Republic of China on the mainland. And we covered this in one of my earlier segments. So after that, many people left Taiwan, sort of sensing that opportunities are not going to be many in Taiwan at that point. And they would have also been escaping one of the world's longest martial law regimes, which was instituted by Chiang Kai-shek, the dictator, in 1949 and lasted until 1987. Now, under martial law, or what's also known as the White Terror period, Chiang Kai-shek's KMT party, which had lost the civil war to the communists in 1949, they brutally persecuted Taiwanese elites, intellectuals, dissidents, anyone who resisted their one-party rule or who had leftist sympathies, because this was an anti-communist regime. And here, when I say Taiwanese, I mean people whose ancestors had come to Taiwan from southern China before the Second World War. Many of them actually during the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, during the Qing dynasty period. And during the White Terror, the KMT murdered and disappeared thousands of Taiwanese people, both actual dissidents and those who were just guilty by association. And the number given is as high as 28,000 by historians. Crucially, they also suppressed local languages. So the ability to speak their mother tongue was just one of the freedoms that Taiwanese people were seeking when they left for the US in the 70s and 80s. And so that's what makes this relevant, that this was a Taiwanese speaking community that was targeted. Now, what's also really interesting and tells us so much about history is that this was a Presbyterian church. Now, during the White Terror period in Taiwan, the Taiwanese Presbyterian Church was a site of resistance, of political resistance. And this is fascinating because the roots of the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan go back to the 19th century, when British and Canadian missionaries established congregations there. Now, like most missionaries, they provided education, social services, and other things while converting populations. But in addition, the church actually had a formative role in the development of a distinctive Taiwanese identity. It was actually Presbyterian missionaries who helped Taiwanese people Romanize their language, which is to say, Taiwanese was a spoken language without a script. And these Presbyterian missionaries, they basically helped people to develop a way of writing Taiwanese using the Roman alphabet, a kind of transliteration. So today, if you actually sign up to take a Taiwanese language class, which you can do in the US, you'll most likely be taught to write Taiwanese using the Roman alphabet as opposed to Chinese characters.
Wow.
So that's a really interesting piece of that history.
Yeah.
Now, in addition to this cultural kind of promotion of Taiwanese identity, the Presbyterian Church is also in Taiwan. It's a deeply political institution. It had pretty close ties to the democracy movement that helped end martial law in the 1980s. And this, this kind of makes sense. I mean, I've been to Presbyterian services in Taiwan before, and it does make sense when you think about the congruence of the teachings around struggle, justice, liberation. So you can think of this as a kind of liberation theology for Taiwan during the Japanese colonial period and also under KMT one-party rule. So to that extent, the Presbyterian Church has very close ties to the Democratic Progressive Party, which is currently in power in Taiwan. And when migrants arrived in the US from Taiwan, they would have gravitated to these institutions, to these churches. And in the US, they functioned as kind of social havens for the Taiwanese American community, especially the elderly who maybe didn't learn English fluently or didn't kind of assimilate in the same way that, say, their children or grandchildren have. So it was really a place where elderly Taiwanese came to support each other and probably a bit less political than it would be in Taiwan. So that's kind of a profile of the church.
Thank you. Incredible.
David, I want to move on to the guy who did this.
Yeah.
This man, David Cho, the shooter, he was, well, details are still emerging about him, but there's a few things we know about him that are relevant, I think. First of all, contrary to assumptions and the initial statement by the sheriff of Orange County, David Cho did not come from mainland China as such. He was born in Taiwan in 1953. So his parents likely came to Taiwan just a few years earlier with Chiang Kai-shek's retreat to Taiwan in the late 1940s. When Chiang Kai-shek arrived in Taiwan, he actually brought around 1 million migrants with him from the mainland. This was the nationalist army and people who had fought with them, collaborated with them, who were fleeing the communists in defeat. These people were known in Taiwan as mainlanders. There was quite a distinction between them and those who had been in Taiwan for centuries before that. Now, this distinction was very salient during the martial law period, and it still retains some significance among older generations in Taiwan. But in the decades since the end of martial law, its salience has faded, partly with the passing of that older generation, partly as a result of intermarriage between the two groups, and partly, I would argue, as a result of the development of a much more inclusive
democratic
definition of Taiwanese identity. Yeah, exactly. The democratic kind of melting pot idea,
right, which
is not based on ethnicity or race, but rather on democratic principles, civic values, basically the ability to vote. You know, so it's right. Supposedly a great leveler. So these days, there's not a huge distinction made between those two groups. But when this man was growing up, there would have been. And it may have even been along class lines, like those who were persecuted the most by Chiang Kai-shek on Taiwan were the elites. They were the intellectuals, the doctors, the lawyers, the people who were involved in politics.
Were they part of the 1 million who came from the mainland, or were they the ones who were already there?
Those who were already there, who had maybe benefited from some of the Japanese education policies under the colonial administration.
I see.
So they would have been, while they were persecuted by the KMT brutally, they would have also retained some of their kind of elite cultural status. And someone like David Cho, whose family came with the nationalists, were compelled to come to Taiwan in defeat. His family would have benefited from some of the policies of the KMT, but culturally speaking, they probably would have been considered inferior to the Taiwanese. Do you see what I mean? It's a funny mix.
Do you mind if I don't want to interrupt you. I'm just curious. No. So Chiang Kai-shek brings with him 1 million mainland Chinese to Taiwan. They dominate, their ethnicity dominates.
Not their ethnicity as such, but their political identity. So the fact that they are associated with the ruling party meant that they were sort of safe from the kind of persecution that was, being directed towards the Taiwanese elites who were resisting one-party rule. So the people who'd been there before, not happy about the situation.
And the people, is it fair to say that the people who had been in Taiwan before Chiang Kai-shek and his 1 million are like Boston Brahmins? They viewed themselves as landed aristocracy. They were smart, like better educated.
Yeah, in many cases that's right. I'm not sure about the landed aristocracy notion, but certainly culturally and in terms of education level, there was a pretty well-established elite who had done quite well under the Japanese, who had educated themselves.
Did Chiang Kai-shek need the the original the people who were there before him to you need
well, it was more of a might makes right kind of a situation for him. So instead of co-opting those groups, that was why he needed to institute martial law, because he wasn't willing to compromise. And there was also this idea that it was only temporary for Chiang Kai-shek, that he was using Taiwan as a perch for him to retake the mainland eventually, which he never fully renounced, even though it was pretty obvious it wasn't going to happen. So it was never, it was a kind of half measure in a way, because he always had his eyes on the mainland. And that actually brings us back to this guy, David Cho, who did not buy the inclusive definition of Taiwanese identity that has grown up in the past few decades. In fact, he seems to have despised it. He identified not as a Taiwanese person, but as a Chinese person. Now, this is kind of confusing and annoying if you're not a real nerd about this stuff, but there's a lot of confusion about this. This man was not necessarily identifying with the People's Republic of China when he identified with being Chinese. And we don't know whether he really identified with the Communist Party of China. But based on what we know of history, it seems like he was motivated by a very potent form of Chinese nationalism that sees Taiwanese identity as an existential threat. And this was a nationalism.
I'm sorry, say that again, please. That last sentence. What was an exit?
He viewed the development of a distinctive Taiwanese identity as an existential threat to his Chinese identity.
I see.
And this kind of Chinese nationalism actually predates the Civil War. It was nurtured during the Republican period after the fall of the Qing. And it shares a one China principle with the Chinese Communist Party. So these two nationalisms, one is like China includes Taiwan and is ruled by the Communist Party of China. The other is China is ruled by the KMT,
right,
and includes Taiwan. So it's like two animals of the same species, two different animals, same species.
So you're saying that because there is this Asian pivot that America is prepping for, we're looking for spending money on a war supposedly to protect Taiwan from China. Are you saying that it wouldn't be a clean war? It would be like Iraq? Like we went into Iraq. Literally, George W. Bush didn't know that there was a difference between Shiites, Kurds, and Sunnis. I'm not making that up. People don't believe me when I say that, but that's true.
Yeah.
So what's going to happen? What similar experience are we going to discover on Taiwan?
Well, it would be a horrible, drawn out, bloody, nasty war. It wouldn't be a clean war. There's no such thing, right?
Would we see a civil war on the island?
No, you would not see a civil war, because within Taiwan today, there is an unprecedented level of kind of unity on the question of Taiwan having its own trajectory, having self-determination, right? There are lots of people on Taiwan who identify with China somewhat, but that doesn't mean they want to be unified with China politically. So what I'm trying to get at here is the idea that they are connected. There are connections, historically conditioned connections between them, but Taiwanese identity has been evolving ever since, the Presbyterians were on Taiwan and before that.
Right.
And it's already developed into its own distinctive thing. And so I think if China were to invade Taiwan, they would meet a hell of a lot of resistance. And I don't think there would be a civil war.
Right.
So, just to tie this up, I guess there's still a lot of things coming out about this shooter's beliefs. he appears to have been a part of the Peaceful Reunification Promotion Association in Las Vegas, which is an entity linked at least to the United Front Work Department of the Communist Party. And today it came out that he sent 7 volumes of diaries titled Diaries of an Angel Destroying Independence, a reference to Taiwanese independence, to a Chinese language newspaper before he set out on his spree. So it sounds like he was a real extremist. There's also some bizarre social media reports that he was roommates with a far-right kind of neo-Nazi figure in Las Vegas. Unconfirmed, but seems plausible, perhaps, given the extremism of his views. So,
what a brilliant way to explain Taiwan.
Oh, good.
Thank you. What a brilliant soft entry point, as Michael Brooks used to say, into what's going on in Taiwan. Well, Grace Jackson, come back Monday, please.
Okay.
Always.
Thank you.
Do every show with us. We love you. I don't forward you the fan mail.
Oh.
Because it's never good. I'm kidding. But I get a lot of emails.
Well, I got to keep my ego in check, David.
Well, I'll crush you, believe me.
Okay.
Grace Jackson is a brilliant, that goes without saying. Her podcast is Literary Hangover, and follow her on Twitter at Grace Jackson. Thank you. And thank you for helping keep the show going. Grace is part of our crew here. So very humbling to have you be a part of the show. Thank you,
Thanks,
Grace.
David. Bye.
Thank you. Say hello to Astrid for me.
I will.
Thank you.